Master Sergeant Jake Morrison had seen 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. His weathered hands bore the calluses of countless hours gripping a rifle, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who had peered through too many scopes, at too many targets. At 42, he was considered one of the finest snipers the military had ever produced, with over 200 confirmed kills and a reputation that preceded him wherever he went. The training facility in North Carolina was buzzing with activity when Morrison first laid eyes on the new recruits. Among the sea of eager faces, one stood out immediately, not because she was exceptional, but because she was a woman. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, her black hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her stance confident despite being surrounded by men who towered over her. Morrison's jaw tightened as he watched her handle the rifle during the initial assessment. In his mind, sniping was a man's job. It required upper body strength to carry heavy equipment across difficult terrain, the mental fortitude to make life and death decisions in split seconds, and the physical endurance to remain motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions. Women, he believed, simply didn't possess these qualities in the measure required for elite sniping. During the lunch break, Morrison approached his commanding officer, Colonel Williams, with barely contained frustration. "Sir, with all due respect, what's she doing here?" He nodded toward Chen, who was quietly studying ballistics charts at a corner table. "This isn't some diversity experiment. Lives depend on the skills we teach here." Colonel Williams, a patient man who had dealt with Morrison's old-school attitudes before, simply replied, "She scored higher on the entrance exam than half your male recruits, Jake. Give her a chance to prove herself before you write her off." But Morrison wasn't convinced. During the afternoon drills, he watched Chen struggle with the heavier equipment, saw her arms shake slightly as she held position during extended exercises. In his mind, this confirmed everything he believed. When she missed her first 3 shots during the precision shooting exercise. Morrison shook his head knowingly. "Maybe you should consider a different specialty," he suggested to Chen after the disappointing performance, his tone not entirely unkind but certainly dismissive. "There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Chen's dark eyes flashed with something Morrison couldn't quite identify. Not anger, but a quiet determination that reminded him of the look he'd seen in his own eyes years ago when instructors had doubted his potential. "I appreciate your concern, Sergeant," she replied evenly, "but I'm not going anywhere." Over the following weeks, Morrison made it his personal mission to prove his point. He designed exercises specifically to highlight what he saw as women's inherent weaknesses in sniper operations. He had Chen carry the same weight as her male counterparts during long-distance marches, assigned her the most challenging shooting positions, and pushed her harder than anyone else in the program. Tuptao. His growing irritation, Chen never complained, never asked for special treatment, and never gave him the satisfaction of quitting. She failed some exercises spectacularly, but she also showed flashes of something that Morrison reluctantly had to admit was talent. Her hand-eye coordination was exceptional. Her mathematical mind could calculate windage and bullet drop faster than most of his veteran trainees, and her patience during surveillance exercises was remarkable. Still, Morrison remained unconvinced. Technical skills could be taught, he reasoned, but the raw physical and mental toughness required for real combat situations couldn't be manufactured in a classroom. Chen might look good on paper and even perform adequately in controlled training environments, but the real world was different. The real world would expose her limitations, and Morrison feared that when it did, good soldiers might die because of it. The other recruits had mixed reactions to Chen's presence. Some, influenced by Morrison's obvious skepticism, treated her with polite but distant professionalism. Others seemed genuinely supportive, recognizing her dedication and incremental improvements. But Chen herself remained focused and largely unbothered by the social dynamics around her, throwing herself into training with a single-minded intensity that impressed even her harshest critics. As the weeks passed, Morrison found himself in an uncomfortable position. His professional obligation was to train all recruits to the best of his ability, regardless of his personal feelings about their suitability for the role. Yet every time he looked at Chen, He saw a potential liability, a weak link that could compromise an entire mission. The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders, reinforcing his belief that some barriers existed for good reasons. Little did Morrison know that thousands of miles away, events were already in motion that would soon test not only Chen's abilities but also challenge everything he thought he knew about courage, skill, and who belonged on the battlefield. The training facility felt like a world unto itself, but both Morrison and Chen would soon discover that their greatest test lay not in the controlled environment of North Carolina, but in the unforgiving mountains of a war zone where theoretical knowledge would meet life-and-death reality. The graduation ceremony at the sniper school was typically a celebration, but Morrison felt more like he was attending a funeral. Chen had passed, barely, meeting the minimum requirements for certification. Her marksmanship had improved dramatically over the 16-week course, and her tactical knowledge was actually among the best in the class. But Morrison still harbored deep reservations about her readiness for actual combat deployment. Chen stood at attention with the other graduates, her uniform crisp and her expression unreadable. When Colonel Williams called her name and handed her the coveted sniper badge, Morrison noticed the slight tremor in her hands. Not from nervousness, he realized, but from barely contained emotion. For her, this moment represented the culmination of years of fighting against institutional skepticism and personal doubt. 3 months later, both Morrison and Chen found themselves assigned to the same forward operating base in eastern Afghanistan. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Morrison was leading a veteran sniper team tasked with providing overwatch for convoy operations, while Chen was assigned to a different unit focused on intelligence gathering and target identification. Despite being at the same base, their paths rarely crossed during the first few weeks of deployment. The base, designated FOB Viper, sat in a valley surrounded by towering mountains that provided perfect concealment for enemy fighters. The terrain was unforgiving, rocky, steep, and riddled, with caves and hidden positions that had sheltered combatants for centuries. It was exactly the kind of environment where Morrison's experience and instincts had kept him alive through multiple deployments. Chen's first weeks in country were spent primarily on reconnaissance missions, using her keen eye for detail to identify potential threats and gather intelligence on enemy movements. Her commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, was initially skeptical about having a female sniper in his unit, but quickly recognized her analytical skills and attention to detail. She spotted patterns in enemy behavior that others missed and demonstrated an uncanny ability to read the landscape for signs of recent activity. Meanwhile, Morrison continued his convoy protection duties, his team successfully completing dozens of missions without incident. His reputation for keeping supply lines safe had made him invaluable to the base operations, and younger soldiers looked up to him as a legend. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was brewing in the surrounding mountains. Enemy activity had been increasing, and intelligence reports suggested that a major offensive was being planned. During one of the rare occasions when Morrison and Chen found themselves in the same briefing room, the tension between them was palpable. Morrison's team had reported increased sniper activity along the main supply route, while Chen's reconnaissance had identified several new enemy positions in the high ground overlooking the valley. When Captain Rodriguez suggested coordinating their efforts, Morrison was visibly reluctant. "With respect, sir," Morrison said, his voice carefully controlled, "my team has been operating effectively in this area for months." Adding inexperienced personnel could compromise our established protocols. His eyes briefly met Chen's, and she understood exactly who he was referring to as inexperienced personnel. Chen didn't respond directly to the slight, but Captain Rodriguez noticed the exchange. "Sergeant Chen has provided some of our most actionable intelligence since arriving," he said firmly. "I think your teams could benefit from sharing information, if not coordinating operations." After the briefing, Chen approached Morrison in the hallway. "Look, I know you don't think I belong here," she said quietly, "but we're on the same side. My job is to gather information that keeps our people safe. Your job is to eliminate threats that could harm our people. We want the same thing." Morrison studied her face, noting the weariness that had already begun to show after just a few weeks in country. Combat aged people quickly, and he could see that Chen was experiencing the same stress and hypervigilance that affected all soldiers in hostile environments. "You're right about wanting the same thing," he admitted. "But wanting something and being capable of delivering it are two different things." Their conversation was interrupted by the wail of incoming mortar sirens. The base erupted into controlled chaos as soldiers scrambled for defensive positions. Morrison and Chen found themselves crouched in the same bunker as explosions rocked the compound. In the dim light, Morrison noticed that Chen's hands were steady as she checked her equipment, her breathing controlled despite the obvious danger. "First time under fire?" he asked, not entirely without concern. "Second," she replied, her voice calm. "But the first time was just a single sniper. This is more intense." The attack lasted 20 minutes, with enemy mortars walking their fire across the base in a systematic attempt to hit critical infrastructure. When the all-clear finally sounded, damage assessment revealed that the attacks had been surprisingly accurate, hitting the communications array, part of the motor pool, and coming dangerously close to the ammunition depot. In the aftermath, as Morrison surveyed the damage and coordinated with base security, he found himself grudgingly impressed by Chen's composure under fire. She had remained calm, focused, and professional throughout the attack. It wasn't the panicked reaction he might have expected from someone he still considered undertrained for the realities of combat. But one attack, Morrison reminded himself, didn't prove anything. The real test would come when Chen found herself isolated under pressure, with lives depending on her ability to perform under the most extreme circumstances. He hoped for everyone's sake that test would never come. Unfortunately, hope was a luxury that soldiers in Afghanistan couldn't afford. The intelligence brief came down from division headquarters on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. A high-value target had been located in a mountain village approximately 15 kilometers from FOB Viper. The target was a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition supply lines, the same routes that Morrison's team had been protecting for months. Major Thompson, the base operations officer, spread the reconnaissance photos across the table in the command center. The village sat on a steep mountainside, accessible only by narrow goat paths and completely dominated by higher peaks on three sides. It was a natural fortress that had been used by various fighting forces for generations. "This is going to be a joint operation," Thompson announced to the assembled team leaders. "We need eyes on the target for at least 48 hours before the assault team moves in. That means we need our best spotters in overwatch positions to confirm the target's presence and monitor enemy strength." Morrison studied the topographical maps, his experienced eye immediately identifying the challenges. The village was surrounded by terrain that offered excellent concealment for defenders, but limited approaches for attackers. Any overwatch position would need to be established under cover of darkness and maintained for extended periods without resupply. "The primary overwatch position will be here." Thompson pointed to a ridge approximately 800 meters from the village, with a secondary position here for redundancy. The secondary position was even more challenging, a rocky outcrop that would require a difficult climb, but offered superior fields of fire. Captain Rodriguez raised his hand. "Sir, I'd like to recommend Sergeant Chen for the secondary position. Her reconnaissance work has been exceptional, and she's demonstrated strong fieldcraft skills." Morrison's jaw tightened. The secondary position was the more dangerous assignment, isolated, difficult to reinforce, and likely to draw enemy attention if discovered. "With respect, sir," Morrison interjected, "this operation requires experienced personnel. My team has worked together for 8 months. We know each other's capabilities." "Your team will take the primary position, Morrison," Thompson decided. "Chen and Corporal Martinez will establish overwatch from the secondary position. Both teams deploy tomorrow night." After the briefing, Morrison cornered Captain Rodriguez in the hallway. "Sir, you're putting Chen in an impossible position. If things go wrong up there, she won't have the experience to adapt. And Martinez is good, but he's not a sniper. He's a designated marksman at best." Rodriguez understood Morrison's concerns, but remained firm in his decision. "Chen has demonstrated excellent judgment under pressure, and her analytical skills are exactly what we need for target identification. Besides, the secondary position is primarily for observation, They're not expected to engage unless absolutely necessary. That evening, Morrison found Chen in the armory, carefully cleaning her rifle and checking her equipment. Her movements were methodical and professional, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. This would be her first extended mission, outside the wire, her first time operating independently in enemy territory. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Morrison said, surprising himself with his almost gentle tone. "If you have any doubts about this mission, now is the time to speak up." Chen looked up from her rifle, her dark eyes meeting his. "I have doubts about a lot of things," she admitted, "but not about my ability to do my job. The question is whether you'll be able to focus on yours without worrying about mine." Morrison realized she was right. His concerns about her capabilities had become a distraction, potentially compromising his own effectiveness. "You're assigned to a difficult position," he said. "That ridge is exposed to fire from multiple directions. If you're compromised, extraction will be nearly impossible." "I understand the risks," Chen replied. "I also understand that this commander has been responsible for killing American soldiers. If my being in that position helps stop him, then that's where I need to be." The next night, both teams moved out under cover of darkness. Morrison's team took a more direct route to their primary position, while Chen and Martinez faced a grueling, 3-hour climb to reach their isolated perch. The terrain was treacherous with loose rocks and steep drops that could easily prove fatal in the darkness. Morrison established his position without incident, settling into a carefully camouflaged hide site that offered excellent views of the village below. Through his scope, he could make out the buildings where intelligence suggested the target was hiding. Everything appeared quiet, with only a few lights visible in windows. Chen and Martinez reached their position just before dawn, exhausted from the difficult climb, but successful in establishing their overwatch point. The location offered a different angle on the village, allowing them to observe areas that were hidden from Morrison's position. Chen immediately began cataloging the layout, identifying potential escape routes and counting the number of fighting age males visible in the early morning hours. As the sun rose over the mountains, both teams settled in for what they expected to be a long wait. The target was reportedly in the village, but confirming his presence and mapping the defensive positions would take patience and careful observation. Morrison had done this dozens of times before, but for Chen, this represented her first real test as a sniper in enemy territory. Through his radio, Morrison could hear Chen's calm professional reports as she documented everything she observed. Her attention to detail was impressive, and her ability to identify subtle changes in the village's routine demonstrated the analytical skills that had impressed her instructors back in North Carolina. Despite his reservations, Morrison found himself grudgingly acknowledging that she was performing her mission competently. But competent performance during daylight observation was one thing. The real test would come if the situation changed, if they were discovered, or if the mission required them to engage targets under pressure. Morrison hoped that Chen's first combat operation would remain a quiet intelligence-gathering exercise, but his experience told him that hope was often the first casualty of war. The first day of surveillance passed without incident. Both teams maintained their positions, documenting movement patterns and building layouts while searching for confirmation of the high-value target's presence. Chen's reports continued to demonstrate her attention to detail, noting subtle changes in guard rotations and identifying what appeared to be a command structure within the village's defensive arrangements. As darkness fell on the second day, Morrison began to feel the familiar tension that came with extended operations in enemy territory. His team had been in position for over 30 hours, surviving on minimal water and cold rations while maintaining constant vigilance. Through his scope, he watched the village settle into its nighttime routine, but something felt different. There was more activity than usual, with armed figures moving between buildings in patterns that suggested preparation for something. Chen's voice crackled over the radio just after midnight. "Primary, this is secondary. I'm seeing significant movement on the north side of the village. Multiple armed individuals moving supplies into what appears to be a defensive position." Morrison adjusted his scope to examine the area Chen had identified. She was right. The enemy was clearly preparing for something, possibly an offensive operation, or perhaps they had detected the surveillance teams. Secondary. Maintain observation and report any changes. We may need to abort if they're aware of our presence. What happened next would be debated in after-action reports for months. A single gunshot echoed across the valley, followed immediately by shouts from the village below. Morrison's blood ran cold as he realized the shot had come from somewhere, near Chen's position. Through his radio, he heard Martinez's panicked voice. Primary, we're taking fire. Chen's been hit." The ridge where Chen and Martinez had established their position erupted in muzzle flashes as enemy fighters, who had somehow managed to climb the mountainside during darkness, opened fire on their concealed location. Morrison could see tracers, arcing through the night, converging on the rocky outcrop where Chen's team was pinned down. "Secondary report status," Morrison called into his radio, but received only static in response. The communication equipment had either been damaged, or Chen and Martinez were too busy fighting for their lives to respond. Morrison faced an agonizing decision: maintain his position to continue the surveillance mission, or abandon his post to attempt a rescue of his fellow soldiers. His team members looked to him for guidance, their faces grim in the green glow of night vision equipment. Sergeant Williams, his spotter, voiced what they were all thinking. "Jake, if we leave this position, we lose everything. The whole mission is compromised." Morrison knew Williams was right from a tactical standpoint. Military doctrine was clear. The mission came first, and individual soldiers were expendable in service of larger objectives. But as he listened to the ongoing firefight echoing across the valley, he found himself thinking about Chen's determination. During training, her composure under the mortar attack at FOB Viper, and her professional competence during the first day of surveillance. "Martinez, Chen, anybody. Report your status," Morrison called again into his radio. This time he heard Martinez's voice, strained and urgent. "Chen's unconscious. She took a round to the helmet, but she's breathing. We're surrounded and running low on ammunition. They're trying to flank us from the south." Through his scope, Morrison could see the tactical situation developing on Chen's ridge. At least a dozen enemy fighters had somehow achieved surprise, probably using a hidden trail that the intelligence briefing had missed. Chen and Martinez were trapped in a rocky depression with limited fields of fire and no realistic possibility of withdrawal down the treacherous mountain face in darkness. Morrison made his decision with the kind of instantaneous clarity that only came from years of combat experience. "Williams, pack up everything but essential gear. We're moving to provide support." His other team members, Sergeants Davis and Thompson, immediately began breaking down their equipment. "This is against protocol," Williams pointed out, though he was already moving to comply with Morrison's orders. "Command specifically said to maintain surveillance on the primary target." "Command didn't anticipate our people getting ambushed," Morrison replied curtly. "We can't complete the mission if half our team is dead." Moving across the steep mountain terrain in darkness while carrying weapons and equipment was extraordinarily dangerous. But Morrison's team had trained extensively for exactly these kinds of emergency situations. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, using established hand signals and their intimate knowledge of each other's capabilities to navigate toward Chen's position. As they climbed, Morrison could hear the intensity of the firefight fluctuating. Periods of heavy gunfire were followed by ominous silences that could mean either a lull in the action or that Chen and Martinez had been overrun. The uncertainty drove Morrison forward with an urgency that surprised him. When had he started caring so much about Chen's survival? 20 minutes into their movement, Morrison's radio crackled with Martinez's voice barely audible above the sound of gunfire. "Anyone listening? This is secondary position. Chen regained consciousness, but she's hurt bad. We're almost out of ammo and they're closing in. If anyone can hear this, we're not going to make it without help." Morrison increased his pace, pushing his team harder across the dangerous terrain. For the first time since the mission began, he found himself genuinely worried about Chen's survival, not because she was inexperienced or unprepared, but because she was a fellow soldier in desperate need of assistance. The realization that his perspective had shifted came as a shock, but there was no time to analyze it further. The sound of gunfire from Chen's position was growing closer, which meant Morrison's team was making progress. But it also meant that time was running out. Whatever was going to happen on that ridge would be decided in the next few minutes, and Morrison found himself praying that Chen would hold on long enough for help to arrive. Morrison's team reached a position approximately 400 meters from Chen's ridge, just as the gunfire intensified to a level that suggested a final assault was underway. Through his night vision scope, Morrison could see muzzle flashes from at least 15 different positions surrounding the rocky outcrop where Chen and Martinez were trapped. The enemy had clearly committed significant resources to eliminating the American surveillance team. "Williams, set up here and provide covering fire on my signal," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of combat leadership. "Davis, Thompson, we're going to try to flank them from the west. The terrain is rough, but it's our only chance to get close enough to make a difference." As Morrison and his two teammates began their flanking movement, Chen's voice suddenly came through the radio, weak but determined. "Primary, this is secondary. Martinez is down. He's alive, but he can't fight. I've got maybe 10 rounds left, and they're preparing for a final push. I can see their leader directing the assault from a position about 600 meters northeast of my location." Morrison paused in his movement, processing Chen's information. 600 meters was an extremely long shot under ideal conditions. In darkness under stress with limited ammunition, and while taking fire, it would be nearly impossible for even an experienced sniper. For Chen, injured and in her first real combat situation, it should have been unthinkable. "Secondary, conserve your ammunition and focus on defensive positions. Help is en route," Morrison responded. But even as he spoke, he knew that his team wouldn't reach Chen's position in time. The enemy assault was building to a crescendo, and within minutes they would overrun the rocky depression where Chen and Martinez were making their last stand. Through his scope, Morrison tried to identify the enemy leader Chen had mentioned, scanning the mountainside for command positions. The tactical situation was clear. If the enemy commander could be eliminated, the assault might falter long enough for Morrison's team to arrive and turn the tide of the battle. Chen's voice came through the radio again, stronger now despite her injuries. "Primary, I have eyes on the target. He's directing fire from behind a large boulder, approximately 630 meters from my position. The angle is difficult, but I think I can make the shot." Morrison's blood ran cold. Chen was talking about attempting a shot that would challenge even the most experienced snipers under ideal conditions. In her current situation, wounded, under fire, using unfamiliar equipment in a high-stress environment, the likelihood of success was minimal. But as Morrison continued his approach toward her position, he realized that Chen might be their only hope. "Secondary, that's an extremely difficult shot," Morrison said into his radio. "Wind conditions are unpredictable. You're shooting uphill in darkness and you're taking fire. Are you sure about the range estimation?" Chen's response carried a confidence that Morrison hadn't heard from her before. "I've been studying this. Target for 3 minutes. Range is 632 meters. Wind is variable but currently favoring left to right at approximately 8 miles per hour. Target is stationary behind cover, but exposing his upper torso when directing subordinates. I have a clear shot." Morrison found himself in an impossible position. His military training and years of experience told him that Chen's proposed shot was too risky. If she missed, it would reveal her exact position to the enemy and likely result in immediate retaliation that would kill both her and Martinez. But his tactical assessment of the situation suggested that without eliminating the enemy commander, Chen and Martinez would be overrun within minutes anyway. "Secondary, you are cleared to engage if you have a clear shot," Morrison finally responded. "Take your time, control your breathing, and remember your training." What happened next would be analyzed in military academies for years afterward. Chen steadied her rifle against the rocky outcrop, her injured body finding stability despite the chaos around her. The enemy commander had positioned himself well, using the boulder as cover while maintaining command visibility over his assault force. But his tactical position also made him predictable. Every 30 seconds he would expose himself to direct his subordinates' movements. Chen synchronized her breathing with the enemy leader's pattern, waiting for the moment when her scope picture would be perfect. The mathematical calculations she had learned in sniper school ran through her mind automatically. Bullet drop, wind drift, target movement, and the slight uphill angle all factored into her final adjustment. The shot, when it came, surprised even Morrison. The distinctive crack of Chen's rifle echoed across the valley, followed immediately by a sudden cessation of coordinated enemy fire. Through his scope, Morrison watched as confusion spread through the attacking force. Their commander had dropped behind the boulder and wasn't responding to their calls for direction. "Target down," Chen's voice came through the radio, calm and professional despite the circumstances. "Enemy command structure appears disrupted. They're withdrawing from advanced positions." Morrison couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. Chen had made a shot that most experienced snipers would have considered impossible under those conditions. The 632-meter shot in darkness while wounded and under fire had not only hit its target, but had single-handedly changed the tactical situation on the battlefield. Within minutes, Morrison's flanking force was able to reach Chen's position as the disorganized enemy forces retreated into the darkness. They found Chen conscious but pale from blood loss, her helmet cracked from the bullet impact that had initially wounded her. Martinez was unconscious but breathing, his injuries serious but not life-threatening. As Morrison knelt beside Chen, while his medic treated her wounds, he found himself struggling to reconcile what he had just seen with his preconceptions about her capabilities. The woman who had struggled with basic exercises during training had just executed one of the most impressive shots he had witnessed in 20 years of military service. "How?" was all Morrison could manage to say. Chen looked up at him with eyes that now held the same distant look he recognized in his own, the look of someone who had been tested in combat and proven themselves. "You taught me that technical skills can be learned," she said weakly. "But you never told me that courage can't be taught. It can only be discovered." The evacuation helicopter arrived 30 minutes after Chen's shot, its rotors beating against the thin mountain air as it settled onto a makeshift landing zone that Morrison's team had secured. Chen was conscious, but weak from blood loss, her head wound requiring immediate medical attention. Martinez had regained consciousness and was able to walk with assistance, though his injuries would keep him out of action for several weeks. As the medical team loaded both wounded soldiers onto stretchers, Morrison found himself walking alongside Chen's litter toward the helicopter. The woman who had made the impossible shot was now barely able to keep her eyes open, but she managed to grab Morrison's sleeve as they reached the aircraft. "The mission," she whispered through the noise of the helicopter. "Did we get confirmation on the target?" Morrison looked down at her, struck by the fact that even while seriously injured, Chen's first concern was mission completion. "We got everything we needed," he assured her. "The operation is a go, thanks to your intelligence work." During their flight back to Fob Viper, Morrison sat across from Chen's stretcher, studying her face in the dim light of the helicopter's interior. The racist and sexist assumptions he had carried for decades felt foreign to him now, like clothes that no longer fit. Chen had not only proven herself capable under the most extreme circumstances, but had actually saved Morrison's life and the lives of his team members through her courage and skill. The base medical facility was prepared for their arrival, with a full surgical team standing by to treat Chen's injuries. The bullet had struck her helmet at an angle, causing a concussion and significant bleeding but avoiding penetration of the skull. She would need surgery to repair damage to her scalp and would be out of action for at least a month, but she would make a full recovery. Morrison spent the next 3 days completing after-action reports and debriefing sessions, but his mind kept returning to Chen's shot. The more he analyzed the tactical situation, the more impressed he became with her performance. She had assessed the battlefield, identified the key target, calculated an extremely difficult shot under pressure, and executed it flawlessly when it mattered most. When Chen was finally cleared for visitors, Morrison found her sitting up in her hospital bed reading intelligence reports on a tablet computer. Her head was bandaged and she looked pale, but her eyes were alert and focused. She looked up when Morrison entered the room, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I owe you an apology," Morrison finally said, sitting down in the chair beside her bed. "Actually, I owe you several apologies. I let my preconceptions about women in combat roles cloud my judgment about your abilities. That was wrong, and it was unprofessional." Chen set down her tablet and studied Morrison's face. She could see that this admission was difficult for him, that it challenged beliefs he had held for most of his adult life. "You weren't entirely wrong about my limitations," she said quietly. "I did struggle with some aspects of training. But you were wrong about what those limitations meant." Morrison nodded, understanding her point. Physical limitations didn't necessarily translate to combat ineffectiveness, just as physical strength didn't automatically guarantee combat success. Chen had found ways to compensate for her weaknesses while leveraging strengths that Morrison had failed to recognize. "That shot you made," Morrison said, shaking his head in amazement. 632 meters uphill in darkness while taking fire. "I've seen veteran snipers miss easier shots under better conditions. How did you know you could make it?" Chen was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "I didn't know I could make it," she admitted. "But I knew that Martinez would die if I didn't try, and probably you and your team too when you tried to rescue us. The shot was difficult, but the alternative was unacceptable." Morrison realized that Chen had demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and moral courage that made the difference between good soldiers and great ones. She had assessed the tactical situation, understood the stakes, and taken decisive action, despite personal risk. These were the qualities that Morrison valued most in his fellow soldiers, regardless